Record. Okay. Oh my God.
This meeting is being recorded.
First, my very first recollection of that I can ever remember of Purim at Beth David was Justin Fromm and how intense he got into it.
No, that would be an understatement. I just, for the benefit of those who are going to access the recording, I'm going to do a 30-second recap of what I said at the beginning. And that is that tonight we're grateful to Sarah and to Julian Zuckerbrod, who are dedicating this event in my honor. And I mentioned before I remembered or was reminded to put on the recording that my very first encounter with Beth David was at the Zuckerbrod Cottage when the Wednesday night study class would have its annual retreat. And what I didn't say before was that Rabbi Pappenheim, Alav Shalom, was supposed to go, but he had a funeral. So he asked, could I cover for him? So it was my very first, I even remember whose funeral it was, but I won't go into that. But it was my very first encounter before I was actually working at Beth David. And it was just a wonderful introduction to learning, to education in the Beth David community. So I'm very grateful to you guys for sponsoring. So I think part of me last week thought, 2 weeks ago thought, because there's a lot of material that I didn't get to, in talking about race and the Jewish people, part of me thought of continuing, but then in giving it further thought and perusing the events of recent days, last couple of weeks in the world, are really difficult. These are really difficult times. So I chose to stick to the original schedule, which meant that tonight was going to be lighter. A lighter topic. There's some humor involved. It's just an easier time, rather than going through the hot and heavy aspects of history, even though there'll be some of that tonight as well. So I chose to stick to the Purim theme that I had originally slotted, and I'm not going to go back to last week's topic tonight. But I just had thought of doing that, but again, I think we need a bit of respite from the extreme heaviness of world events that we are experiencing. On another happier and potentially happier note, that you having difficulty hearing me? Is that a consensus, or is that one per? You guys having trouble hearing me?
No.
Yes,
Really?
it's very loud, very low.
Let me try something.
I'm having no problem here.
Is it better now?
Yes,
I turned up my
much,
speaker.
much better.
Okay, because I've tried something new, which I guess does affect the volume of putting a screen on to shade this, but I guess that obstructs the sound a bit. Okay, that's helpful to know. So hopefully you'll hear me better. Hopefully you want to hear me. That may not. I mean, that's another story. But one of the so again, I want to stick with Purim because it's a bit lighter than world events. One of the more optimistic notes, again on the same page as it were, is that we look like, God willing, we're moving towards a better environment in terms of the pandemic, and maybe we're seeing a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I'm almost afraid to say that, but it looks like there's a little bit of room for some optimism that we are maybe rounding the corner here. My hope at one point was that these sessions would be hybrid, that we would have an in-shul gathering and also be on Zoom, so to give people a choice. That clearly wasn't possible for these sessions. My hope might be that maybe the last session we could do that way. I don't know, we'll see. But that would be amazing if we could have one in-person session. And if not, we will continue. There are only three. After tonight, there are only 2 more sessions, so there isn't a lot of future this year. But God willing, next year we will be in a room in the shul and together. And again, we will probably make some live streaming availability for those who are not able to access. But nonetheless, it's good to see all of you, even if I'm looking at you're all in your boxes, and we're getting used to seeing people in boxes. There's one advantage of Zoom, of course, that it's nice to you have the power to mute people. If we could do that on a Shabbos, and during Torah reading, if we could put the congregation on mute, I think that would be an amazing event. But of course, we love everybody and we love the conversation. So there's certainly every disadvantage has its advantages. Okay, let's look at some material. I want to discuss Purim from a couple of aspects with you today. First, a little glance at the history, and I have to share this 1 second. Okay. Now, this is, from a guide that was put out by the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. And they put out some very good material on holidays. I've used some of this in the past. But there's a nice little introduction to Purim and a couple of paragraphs by, as we can see, Rabbis Joanna Samuels and Rebecca Rosenthal, who've written a very nice introduction to Purim and to the Megillah, to what the whole story is about. And that talking about the story being the parody of an ineffectual king, a diaspora Jewish community, seemingly unconnected to roots. It is an unusual book. You probably know this. It's the only book of the Bible where God is never mentioned. I mean, that's one of the trivia questions. What name is missing from the book of Esther, from the Megillah of Esther? And it happens to be God. So that is kind of unusual in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, that God not be present in a book. It almost can be viewed as a very secular story. There's no davening in it. There's no Birkat Hamazon. There's no Shacharit. There's no even going back to times of the sanctuary. There's no and this probably would have overlapped with. This might have overlapped with there being it definitely would have overlapped with there being in the temple period. Maybe it's the period between the two temples. We're not sure about the actual timing of the story, but certainly sacrifice would have been familiar to the people. That's not mentioned. There's no so it's a rather secular document, which is really, really fascinating. And of course the story begins in a very non-Jewish way, and dealing with this parade, this beauty contest, which seems to go against all Jewish values, but yet you have this candidate to seek the choice of the king, this candidate who parades to demonstrate her beauty, and to be chosen by, and is chosen by the king, this young Jewish woman who doesn't reveal her Jewishness at all until it is essential later in the story. But at the beginning, it's not revealed. Her name, as is indicated here, it's linked to the pagan goddess Ishtar. Esther is not Hebrew. It's a Persian name. In the Megillah, she's also known as Hadassah, which is a Hebrew name. And the hospital is named after Hadassah, not Esther. It would sound weird, Esther Hospital, so Hadassah Hospital, I guess, sounds better. But there's a lot of peculiarity of this story. By the way, Mordechai is also not a Hebrew name. It's also probably Persian in origin. It's not Hebrew in origin. Now it becomes a Hebrew name, but it's not originally a Hebrew name. But that will be true of a lot of biblical names. So the story is peculiar on many, many levels. In a way, it's the story of one that's familiar in Jewish history, of course. We've heard of anti-Semitism. We hear about it a lot these days, sadly, of course. And that is obviously very central to the theme. But the interesting thing about the anti-Semitism in the story of Purim is not that it's not classical anti-Semitism. Is that ab initio Haman is out to get the Jews. He's only out to get the Jews when Mordechai doesn't bow down to him, and then he learns that Mordechai is a Jew. And only then, when he wants to get it back at Mordechai, does he take it out on Mordechai's people. You didn't bow down to me, I'm going to destroy you and your entire people. But had that not happened, had that incident not taken place, had Mordechai not been sitting where he was and had been at home or in shul or wherever when shopping, then this story may not have happened. This potential massacre of the Jews may never have been planned, because it was only after the fact that Haman chose the Jews. So it's in a sense, it's personal revenge. It's all him. It's not specifically, like God, like Yimach Shemam V'Zichram, like the Hitlerian Holocaust, which of course was, predetermined to be targeting the Jews. It wasn't just because of an incident. It was it was fundamental anti-Semitism. This was after the fact anti-Semitism, as it were. So it does differ from what we're used to. It's nothing is classic about this story. We will get to the lighter portions, I promise you. So if you go to if you can see what I've highlighted, I'm just going to read a little bit of this. The many varied observances of Purim highlight the holidays' seemingly conflicting themes. The holidays' seemingly conflicting themes of persecution and gaiety. Blotting out the name of Haman is reflecting both the remembering who was our adversary, but also celebrating the story, celebrating his defeat and his destruction. He's getting what he wanted to give to the Jews. And some historians have noted, rather interestingly, that if you go back, the early years of the 20th century and prior to that, when Jews in most of the world found themselves rather powerless. We didn't have Israel. We didn't have an army. We didn't have, we were sometimes not possessing the power that we really should have been possessing in terms of standing up for ourselves. So it has been described that one of the acts of revenge, and it was custom, late Rabbi Pappenheim shared this with me, that the custom in Germany before the war and in some other places was, what did you do when you read the Megillah? You would write the name of Haman, you write Haman's name in Hebrew, on the sole of your shoe, and when the name would be read, you would basically lightly tap your shoe on the floor to be erasing the name of Haman. I mean, making very little noise because they were very decorous, and particularly in German culture, people were very decorous and didn't like disruption. By the way, Rabbi Pappenheim always hated Purim. He never liked Purim because he couldn't deal with. He had difficulty with the frivolity and the celebration. He was more, rigid according to his background in terms of sticking to a structure, and having people running around and going wild was never his thing. I share a little bit of that, by the way, but I don't have any German ancestry to attribute it to, even though Scheim, I understand, originally is a German name, but that's another story. So, but that was the practice at some point, not to make the noise we do now with all kinds of machinery and groggers and whatever, air rifles and stuff that people used to make this great noise when Haman's name is recited during the reading of the Megillah. It was done very subtly at certain points in history, and but that was again, as the writers here are describing, it was one of there's a duality here. We're remembering our enemy, which is not necessarily happy, but B, celebrating the victory and rejoicing in the holiday, having fun while we're doing it. So making the noise during Haman it's fun. Kids love it. People love it. But ultimately, it's the fundamental act of what we're doing is based in profound seriousness. Okay. Now, so here it goes. This is sort of what I mentioned to you before already, that Mordechai, that Haman vows to, basically his initial response is to take revenge on Mordechai, who doesn't bow down to him, who doesn't give him the respect he's due, and only after the fact does it become an assault on the Jews. So I want to look at this paragraph with you briefly that says hidden and revealed. That Purim is a holiday fundamentally about turning things upside down and inside out. God, as I've mentioned, whose name is never mentioned in the Megillah, is hidden from the story. And Esther, whose name also means hidden, lahastir in Hebrew, is to hide, to conceal. So her name comes from the same, Esther, if you want to look at a Hebrew equivalent, even though originally it was a Persian name, it's the same word that means to hide. Even though the Esther originally probably is not coming from that, it's coming from the Persian, but nonetheless in Hebrew it connects to the word that means to hide. So she's concealing her identity. She's a Jew in hiding, as it were. And also the writers indicate that Haman starts high and ends low, from prestige to execution. It's quite a fall. Mordechai, the other way around, from sitting at the city gates threatened by Haman to taking over his property and offices. So that is, that's an interesting way of viewing the Purim story, and it's a day when we tend to have a lot of fun, and we'll get more into that. We'll get more into that as we progress in our discussion tonight. I want to look at one other thing here, and then I'm going to pause so I can look at you and see if any of you want to ask anything, and then I want to look at some other stuff with you. One of the conclusion of this introduction is that Purim has multiple purposes. One is it's a mitzvah to celebrate, to have fun, to rejoice. We say that Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, with the month of Adar, we increase our joy, as opposed to the month of Av, when we diminish our joy. Av is a month of sadness because of Tisha B'Av. Purim is a month of celebration because of Adar is a month of celebration because of Purim. And this year we have the 2 months of celebration because we had the first Adar, and which doesn't include Purim, but we still have that idea that we're supposed to be happy and celebrate in a leap year over 2 months. So you have the idea of celebration, but we also do stuff that's kind of serious, which also is relevant to the time we're living in. We give gifts to our friends, mishloach manot, which is lovely, but most important, matanot le'evyonim, that we basically take care of others by giving gifts to the poor and enabling those who otherwise would be unable to celebrate Purim to be part of the festivities. And the idea is, as they indicate here, that people shouldn't have to ask for the charity. The impetus is on the giver to fulfill the mitzvah by giving without being asked. Although, of course, if someone asks, you still give. So some say that really emphasize the giving of gifts to friends, but better one should really emphasize the giving to the poor. And just interestingly, some of you are aware, I'm just going to pause this for a moment. Some of you are aware that I have involvement in an organization called Masorti Olami, the worldwide Masorti or conservative movement. I have 6 months left in my presidency of that organization, so I'm somewhat involved in it. And we have communities in Ukraine and communities throughout Europe. And we've been involved in recent weeks in literally helping hundreds of our families escape Kiev and some of the Kharkov and to either move to places in Ukraine that are not under fire, and many to actually go into neighboring countries, and some even to come to Israel. So our organization's been, and one of the things we've been campaigning, and actually raised a lot of money. People have been very generous. Worldwide, we've been getting donations, but we've themed our campaign. For Purim we say matanot le'evyonim, and so we're doing it / matanot le'evyonim, gifts for the poor we're doing it as well for plitim. Plitim are refugees. So we're doing matanot le'evyonim and matanot le'plitim, gifts for the poor, gifts for refugees. So in a sense we're and we've been trying to arrange mishloach manot to all the families that have been forced into temporary or maybe permanent exile from their homes in terribly difficult circumstances. And you've all been following the story, and know. So it does give us opportunity to make relevant some of the what's going on in the world right now, even during our celebration. Even in good times, our celebration is never allowed to overlook those who cannot celebrate, who are suffering, who are enduring difficulty. One of the things, I'm not sure how much it's happening during COVID, but one of the nice things that the Beth David community has been doing is that in addition to people through this campaign of giving Mishloach Manot to friends and to fellow members of the congregation, we've always been providing Mishloach Manot to people that are shut in or during illness, etc. Because that's obviously, it's very important to think of those who are struggling, especially at times when we're supposed to be celebrating. So let me look at, I want to just see if I've been, every time I go on for like 15 minutes or so, I want to just take a breath and see if anyone wants to comment or say anything or ask a question. There's not a lot to question yet. I haven't been that controversial yet. Give me time. But let me just see. I'm just looking at all the faces. I can't see people that are not screened, but I think there's a way of putting up a hand electronically. Okay, nothing yet, so I will give you a chance after if anything comes up. And I'm fine if there are no questions. I'm not insulted if there are no questions. I never ask questions. I'm one of these people that would go to. I mean, there are people who, when we have public events or when I was in school even, I'm the kind of quiet guy that sits and listens, and maybe once in 5 years I ask a question. Other people asking a question every minute. So I respect people who don't ask questions. I also respect people who ask questions. I told the story once of, because I had that reputation of being in class, I was kind of quiet. I mean, I did, if I was asked to read, I would read, I was prepared, and I would, if I had to ask a question, if the teacher asked me a question, I would answer the question, but I wasn't overly involved in those kinds of discussions or conversations. So I think I once told this story when I gave my graduating sermon 41 years ago. My God, I can't believe 1981, so I guess that's 41 years ago. And it was a pretty good sermon. I won the prize for the best sermon of the year, so I guess it was decent. I used the same sermon to audition at Beth David, and I got the job, so I changed a few things in it. But it was, so it was, one of my teachers said, after he said, I never heard you talk. You're so quiet. I was really... So I said, there are those moments every 5 years I say something. Okay, back to... I want to share again. Talking too much. I want to go back to this for a moment to look at a couple of texts with you. Okay, so let's look at the Megillah a little bit. Just, you see, I've highlighted a few lines. I'm not doing a lot of this with you, but some of it. In the third chapter of the Megillah, and this is now... Haman is now speaking to the king Hashverosh, who's basically clearly an idiot king. I mean, he's, clearly he is not necessarily fundamentally evil, but he has, he's really quite stupid and listens to the last person that spoke to him will be where he takes advice. I won't mention any world leader who fit that pattern. I'm not going to go into politics right now, but he clearly was, he was... a verbrannte idiot, basically. There was no question about that. And so he goes, he probably never thought of Jews in his life, didn't know anything about it. So, and Haman, now who realizes that Mordechai, his adversary, is a Jew, goes to Achashverosh and says, Yeshno am echad mefuzar umeforad bein ha'amim. There's this one certain people scattered and dispersed among the nations, b'chol medinot malchutecha, and throughout your kingdom, in all the provinces of your kingdom, V'datehem shonot mikol am, their faith, their religion, their laws, and translated here, are different from any other. They are unique, and they don't observe your law. I mean, their law is different from your laws. So you don't want them to remain active. You don't want them to hang around. Is it here? Ein shoveh lahanicham. You don't want to leave them unimpeded. So if it is pleasing to the king, he says, Im ala melech tov, yikatev la'obdam. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. I'm not going to give you money if you do it. So the king basically, again, has no agenda, no knowledge, no, humanity or lack thereof. He's basically this empty shell. And he says, okay, whatever you want, do what you want. Like, he doesn't really care. That will change when he realizes that his beloved Esther is Jewish, of course. So that's giving you a sense of, in a way, a very poor reflection on leadership. And look, we see, we see, I'm going to pause every so often I can't go away from current events. When you have the paradigm of two leaders in the world today, we have Zelensky, who's one of us, who is amazing, courageous, unexpectedly, rising to the occasion of leadership. One who was a comedian, who almost as a joke became president, and everyone laughed. No one's laughing now. And then you have on the other side, you have Putin, as a former Quebecer, Poutine, as he's been called now in many places, who is not doing, not making anyone proud except people that are on the very wrong side of history. So we see, leadership being exemplified. We see, examples in our own country of leadership, not on such severe levels, but nonetheless some of the challenges we've had locally in Canada in the last month or so, where we have some leaders who've been appropriate, who've been good, and some who've been very inappropriate, some who've been effective, some who've been ineffective. So this, the Megillah certainly has a lot to say about leadership, and lack thereof, and the danger of having ineffective or unqualified leaders making decisions for their populations, and the destruction that can ensue. And again, we're seeing that played out in world history at this very moment in time, very sadly. But now we see, now we see Esther. Now we see Mordechai, who's again one of the heroes of this story. And by the way, Mordechai, who was a hero of the story, the end of the Megillah is fascinating. The final verse basically pays tribute to Mordechai. And one of the most amazing things that it says about Mordechai, he's getting credit for really having been instrumental in saving the Jewish people. It says that he was Ratzui l'rov echav. He was desirable or liked or appreciated by most of his people. So there were still Jews who didn't like Mordechai, and he saved them. So the joke is, I mean, my God, what do you have to do to be liked by everybody, to be universally accepted? So the truth be told, there'll be never a leader in Jewish history, or probably in human history, that will have a 100% approval rating, even if they save the world. There'll be those who are not going to be happy because they did something they didn't do that they should have done. So it's almost comical at the end of the Megillah that says that Mordechai was loved by most of his people, the majority, but not everybody. What would have he had to do he would have to save them twice? Not clear what he would have had to do. But here he says to Esther, he's encouraging Esther then, because Esther basically knows what's going to be happening, and he says to her, Ki'im tacharishi ba'et azot. If do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews, because once you know what's going to happen, for you to remain, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. In other words, you have the ability to save your people, not a time to be silent. And we know that silence is something that we have to fear and that we have to avoid. And we saw, it's not long ago, celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Soviet Jewry movement, and that's still kind of something we talk about. And how when Elie Wiesel wrote in 1966 his incredibly important book, The Jews of Silence, and people thought he was basically talking about the suffering of our people in then the former Soviet Union, and people thought he was talking about how the Jews in Russia were silent. He said, no, it's not the Jews in Russia who are silent. It's we Jews who are not in Russia, Jews of the world who are not shrine Gewalt, that were not yelling and screaming, and then we started to yell and scream, and eventually, good result happened. And I'm sure that our yelling and screaming, it didn't totally change geopolitics, but many have argued that it did have influence. So the idea here, starting with Esther, being told by Mordechai, don't be silent. You know that your people are in danger, and you have to think beyond yourself. You gotta speak out. You gotta find the courage to stand up to evil and to say what needs to be said. And okay, this one I'm gonna skip. So now something really interesting. I want to share with you a couple of other tidbits of learning, and then we can talk. This is from Maimonides, from the Rambam, from the Mishnah Torah. And this is a concept that appears in other places as well, in classical sources. It's an absolutely mind-boggling statement. I'll read it to you in the original. Kol sifrei ha-nevi'im v'chol ha-ktuvim atidin libatel limot ha-Mashiach. in the days of the Messiah, all of the books of the prophets and the writings, like the third portion of the Hebrew Bible, Psalms, Proverbs, the Megillot, etc., all of the non-Torah books, not the Torah, but the rest of the Hebrew Bible are going to basically be null. They're going to be annulled. They're going to disappear. Chutz mi Megillat Esther, except with the exception of the Megillah of Esther. And it goes on to say, I'm going to read the whole thing because I love the Hebrew of Mishnah Torah is the most beautiful Hebrew around, magnificent Hebrew. And also for those who have learned Hebrew, are not fully proficient, it's a very clear and I don't want to say simple Hebrew, but it's not a complicated Hebrew. It's actually a good text to read, even if you're not totally Hebrew proficient. So it goes on to say, Harahi kayemet kachamisha chumshei Torah, the Megillah of Esther will endure forever, like the 5 books of the Torah, and also v'kehalachot shel Torah sheba'al peh, like the oral Torah, she'enan betelim, that will never be nullified, that will never disappear. So basically, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the oral Torah, all of the books of law, and the Megillah of Esther, but the other books of the Torah, which are mostly dealing with history and poetry, they're not going to survive. But Megillah is going to survive. I want to in a moment discuss this with you. Then he goes on to say, even though all memory of our suffering will be erased, because with the vanishing of the history portions of the Hebrew Bible, all of our tzuros is going to disappear as well, but not the story of Purim. Lo yasof mizaram, that will never be annulled. That will be with Yemei Purim. These days of Purim will never leave us. We'll always remember the story of Purim. So I am going to I'm going to just unshare, and I'm going to look at you and ask. I want to ask a question. I want to get someone to offer a suggestion or two. What does that mean? What does Maimonides? What does the Rambam mean? What does our tradition to say that all these books of the Bible are not going to survive? There'll be no more Book of Psalms, no Proverbs, no Chronicles, no Prophet, Shmuel, Sefer Shmuel, Melachim, all the books that we read, and the prophets are going to go. All of the Haftarot that we read, there'll be no more Haftorah. We'll get out of shul sooner. No more Haftorah readings. Those books will all disappear, except for Megillat Esther. That's going to survive. The written Torah will survive. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the Torah. They'll survive. And then Megillat Esther. That's the rest. That's it for the Hebrew Bible. What is that? What are they saying? What does that come from? What do you think of that? Okay, I see. Larry?
Yeah, it's very interesting that just the opposite so far has been happening with the Qumran, the scrolls from the Dead Sea. They've pieced together as many fragments as they can, and they found all the books of the Bible except Esther. Esther's the only one that they haven't found any trace of.
That's wonderful. That I didn't know that. I know they found books. I didn't realize they didn't find Esther. That's very cool. That's interesting. So it's the reverse of this teaching.
That's what is happening so far.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. But anyway, what would be the rationale, though? What do you think? What does the Rambam and others who argue this? Where do they come? Where are they getting this? I mean, yeah, it is a classical teaching. The idea that this is, this is when the Mashiach comes. This is not happening next Thursday. I shouldn't say the Mashiach's not coming next Thursday, but I understand he's busy. He has another appointment next Thursday. But this is not something that that's the greatest job security in the world is the person who's hired to watch the Mashiach. Let's assume that this is not happening in the short term. So but at some point, the end of history, as it were, all these books except why is Esther the standout book above everything else? Let me see. Noreen?
Could it be that we need the books of Moses because we need our history.
Excuse me, if you're not talking, do me a favor and mute yourselves if you're not talking. Okay, go on, Noreen, sorry.
Okay, we need our history. And we need the story of Purim because we need something to brighten our lives.
Well, maybe that's the same reason that I didn't change the program for tonight, because we needed some uplift in a time of in a time of struggle, a time of challenge. We needed a bit of uplift, and maybe that's where this is coming from. But it's ironic, why is this really ironic? It's really ironic. Once again, what's one saying? Leonard?
I was thinking that at the time of the Mashiach, perhaps the thought is that we won't need all those other books, but we will always need to be reminded who we are and where we've come from, and to stand up for who we are, the way Esther did.
Maybe it could be. But what's really one of the reasons why this is so astounding? I'm just trying to see if there are other hands raised. One of the reasons why this is so astounding is, as I said at the beginning, this is the least religious book of the Bible. No God. There's nothing. There's no tefillah, no prayer, no sacrifice. There's no religious expression. It's, in a sense, as and I used the term before, it's virtually a secular document. It's a great story. There's there's no religion in it. It's Jewish survival, yeah, for sure. But if the book, maybe they're covering themselves because they're saying, well, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah is going to survive, and the oral Torah, which is all the halacha, that's going to survive. Okay, so we're safe. But the fact that the book that's singled out, I think all of you are correct in assuming that part of the importance of survival is so great and it tells us the importance of having something to celebrate. That the time of the Mashiach, we're going to forget service, we're going to forget suffering. That's going to be put aside, and it's going to be the rejoicing that's going to take precedence. It's the joy, it's the simcha that's going to prevail. Maybe going back to the idea that when a wedding procession and a funeral procession meet at an intersection, according to the Talmud, when they two meet they used to have processions. They still do in some circles. You have a wedding procession outdoors. You basically, and you do it sometimes today more indoors, but you still have them in some circles where you basically usher the couple to the chuppah, in a very dramatic fashion, in a public way, and you have these processions that would be outdoors. And you'd also have funeral processions where you would escort the deceased. So what happens if they meet at an intersection? So the halacha is that the funeral procession waits for the wedding procession to proceed.
Right.
The simcha has to come first, and that's paradigmatic for a lot of ideas in Jewish law and Jewish life. That simcha, not in every case, but very frequently will take precedence over sorrow, and that may be the reason why it's Esther and not Eicha that's going to survive. Eicha is one of the books that's going to disappear when the Mashiach comes, we're told. All of the sad lamentations, the saddest book in the Hebrew Bible. It's so painful. And other books also in the prophets, all its service and all this, and the people sinning and this and all bad and everything terrible. All of that's going to gone, but we're going to have Esther, which is the good news book. Ultimately, it has bad news in it, but it ends up on a very positive level. So that is really, again, it's kind of shocking, and I think there's shock value in the teaching, and that's deliberate. But maybe it's, but it's also significant that, I've often said, and I really believe strongly that, I'm really, basically because of my career choice and how I've lived my life, or most of my life at least, I have, except my earliest life, I wasn't so into it, but most of my life I've lived, in accordance to whatever extent that I could with Jewish tradition and Jewish practice. But I've always felt that we should never diminish the value of Jews who are secular too. Sometimes that's cast as an aspersion. It's pejorative to say so and to say, but we should never view it that way. There'd be no Israel were it not for secular Jews. There'd be no Israel. I mean, now that religion is so strong and there are more religious Hebrew texts being published in the state of Israel today than all of cumulative Jewish history. throughout from the very beginning of books to this moment, you know, all take whatever was printed before the State of Israel and what's being printed today, produced today in Israel. I'm talking about religious text. It is a far greater volume of text now in 75 short years being produced in Israel than in all of 2,000 years of Jewish history before that. So it tells you that Israel has been great for religious Jews, and not that all religious Jews have been respectful of those who are not, but that's another subject. But nonetheless, were it not for secularists, there'd be no Israel. Israel was produced overwhelmingly by Jews who are not part of religious practice, so I think that's something that's really great to keep, and that's also a message of Esther, of the Megillah. You know, they're saying that this is going to be a book that's going to survive through eternity, and it's a book that basically doesn't view Judaism or Jewish life from the perspective of religion. So never denigrate people that are secularist. I mean, I love tradition. I think tradition is great, and it does preserve us. It does help us build a future of meaning. And there've always been Jews who've maintained the tradition. There'd be more, that would be great. But those who are from the other side but still maintain an Ahavat Yisrael, a love of the Jewish people, they make a great contribution that can never be diminished. It's interesting that many of our, the people that are the strength of many of our congregations, including Beth David, including many Orthodox shuls, grew up in the Shomer HaTza'ir movement, in other secular Zionist movements, and yet found themselves in religious surroundings. And what lit the spark was not sitting and studying Gemara, but what lit the spark was Israel, Zionism, Jewish people, Jewish values. But that in many, many cases led to very serious engagement with Jewish practice. And I think we can't diminish the contribution. I gave a sermon once that I never give titles to sermons. It wasn't my practice, but I published a sermon once in the Rabbinical Assembly and actually gave it a title. It was when I spoke many years ago, one of my sermons that I really liked. I mean, not all other people liked it, but I liked it. So I shared it with other people, and it was on, the theme of the sermon was Tel Aviv. I did it on the 100th anniversary of Tel Aviv. So it's a long time ago. It's like 15 years ago, whatever that was. And, I think it was 2009, I think, was the 100th anniversary. So it would have been 12 years ago, 13 years ago. The theme was that the idea of the builders of Tel Aviv was this act of people who were built by people that were basically very secular, not at all observant. It was not built by Hasidic Jews. Founded built out of nothing from scratch. Jerusalem was always there. Tel Aviv was sand dunes. It was created out of nothing. Basically, you had Jaffa there, old Jaffa, but next to it was the city created out of sand. And it's become a thriving Jewish metropolis. And I entitled that sermon, and I Tel Aviv Yer Kodesh, Tel Aviv, the holy city, which of course everyone talk. Jerusalem is the holy city. There's a holiness to Tel Aviv too, even though a holiness that came out of secularism, from secular roots. So I really strongly believe that. The poet Avram Shlansky, a great Israeli poet in the early 20th century, was part of the generation of the pioneer, the Chalutzim. And he was a poet, but he also was a paver. He paved roads he was helping to build Israel. And in the area of what would become Tel Aviv, he was paving roads. And in one of his poems, he describes the pavement that he was building, the roads that he was creating. He compares them to the straps of the tefillin. The ritzulot, the straps of the tefillin, that's how he envisioned the black asphalt roads that he was paving. I think it's a beautiful image. He wasn't putting on tefillin, and I guess I would not have been unhappy were he putting on tefillin. But he saw that image in what he was doing to build a country. And because of those roads, a lot of religious Jews can drive to a shul and put on tefillin and daven. And so it enabled a lot of people to live religious lives in Israel. But it began from people who were not there. So that I think is one of the gifts of Esther. So let's look at a couple of things. Let me take you back to a text for a moment or two or 10. Okay. So this will be some of the more fun stuff, I hope. Now, we talked about how one of the great mitzvot of Purim is matanot levyonim, gifts for the poor, and I mentioned what we're doing now, the matanot leplitim, the gifts for the refugees. So then we have a discussion as to weighing these two things together. Mishloach mano ish l'rehu, we have the gifts of food given to a friend, and so it's shtei manot li'ish echad, you give two portions to one person, and when it comes to when it comes to gifts to the poor, two gifts to two distinct people. So now one. So there's discussion also whether you're giving two gifts to friends as well. Minimally two, most give two in both cases. But the idea being that so there's a lot of discussion in sources as to what the nature of the gifts were. So it's interesting because we tend to do rather parv gifts, in other words, tame gifts like maybe a hamantash and a fruit, or an apple and a hamantash, or maybe a little bottle of wine. We do a little kitzi. So, but they sometimes give very serious gifts, like you have Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya giving Rabbi Oshaya the leg of a third-born calf and a jug of wine. So that's really serious mishloach manot. So the story is told here that this, in a sense, was doing two at once, because he was giving a gift to his friend, but he was also giving a gift to the poor at the same time. So he felt he gave a very expensive gift, a very substantial gift, because the person needed the food. So here you have ideas of what the Purim gifts were: a sack of dates and a cupful of roasted flour. And okay, so that's exciting. Give you ideas, like good mishloach manot ideas if you're wondering what to give. And here's an interesting concept. Again, this is from the Talmudic tractate Megillah, that Mare Bar Mar, he basically gives a gift of basically Malay Tuska de Zangbila. I mean, it's a word. It's an Aramaic word that people who speak Aramaic have trouble saying. A sack full of ginger and a cupful Malay kasa de pilpalta, or pilpalata, a cupful of long peppers. Oh, sorry, pilpalta aricha. And this is also, were very expensive. And but Rabbi makes a comment. He says, that's interesting, because I sent him sweet stuff and he sent me pungent ones. Like, basically a comment that's saying you probably should be, you don't want to, like, sending a bottle of Tabasco sauce may not be the best gift to give him for mishloach manot. You want to give something that's going to be sweet, that's going to make someone cheerful and happy, and not necessarily something that's going to burn their mouth off. But that's an interesting, if you want to be provocative. I think I told the story once of I had a close friend who, still have a close friend, he lives in Israel now. When I was at JTS, he was at Yeshiva University. And it was Purim morning, we were sitting in the shul at the JTS davening. And he walked in, they had an earlier minyan at Yeshiva University, he came in to bring me mishloach manot. So he walks into the shul and hands it to me and then leaves. So, most people, again, were giving a hamantash and an apple. He brought me a roast chicken and a hot dog. And two items, because one halacha says it should be shtei manot basar, it should be two portions of meat. That's one source, and he's a big meat eater, so he had to fulfill that, so he brought me a chicken. And to tell you that it stunk up the whole shul would be an understatement. Everyone was wondering where this odor was coming from, and it was hot. It was like mamash, it wasn't like it was in the refrigerator. So the whole, this aroma of, it was everyone was looking around where this is coming from, and I, of course, was hiding. But then you have, he may have known Abaye, who lived a long time ago, but so when he goes to Mari Bar Mar's house, this is what the meal they serve. This is a good place to go for dinner. 60 plates of 60 kinds of cooked dishes. and I had 60 portions from each of them. The last dish was called pot roast, and I was still so hungry that I wanted to chew the plate afterward. One of my teachers did argue that there is humor in the Talmud, and I suspect that this has been humorous. There's obviously some guzma, there's some exaggeration. I think it's highly unlikely that he ate 60 portions from 60 plates, from each of them, 60, so that's 60 times 60. What's that, 3,600, I think? And then he was still hungry. This guy has a gesund appetite. You know, that's really serious eating. So then in the continuation of this Gemara this explains the folk saying that the poor man is hungry and does not know it, as Rabbi was unaware how hungry he had been in his master's house. In other words, he was so hungry that he ate like for 3,000 people. But he didn't realize how hungry he was because he was poor. He didn't realize he was so hungry. And there's another popular expression, because we talked about Abaye saying that you should send sweet items, that there's always Ravcha Vesima Shriach. In other words, this can be translated in today's language as there's always room for dessert. Room in the stomach for sweets can always be found is the literal translation, but the idea being that, so encouraging, Abaye is encouraging that you want to bring something that's sweet. It adds to the joy of the festival. Interesting idea for people who don't have a lot of money, but they want to give gifts of food. You had this, the Gemara tells us that it was permitted to do the following. You have Abaye bar Avin and Rabbi Chanina bar Avin, these two sages, two friends, who would exchange their meals with each other. They were Mechalfi Su'udataihu Lahadade. They would exchange their meals with each other. If you look at the footnote here, one who lacks the means to send portions to another may share a meal with another, and they both fulfill their obligation of giving gifts of food to their friends, of Mishloch Manot. But this way they're getting and giving at the same time. So they can exchange, you can do an exchange. So this way, each one is, if you can't afford to give food and not have food for yourself, you're serving both purposes. So this, taking into consideration that everyone can afford to do this. So now we get to a very famous story in the tractate of Megillah, tractate that deals, with a lot of other issues. It deals with a lot of synagogue procedure, but primarily deals with the laws of Purim and the laws of reading the Megillah, tractate Megillah, which was part of the Daf Yomi series about a month ago. So this is a very famous teaching of Rava, Mechayiv Inish Levasume Biforia Adelo Yada Ben Arur Haman Levaruch Mordechai. Rava said, and this is a very interesting text, a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until he is so intoxicated that he does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. That's the famous. In other words, he just loses all sense of reality. And I want to just read a commentary on that particular Gemara. If we look here at this footnote, a person is obligated to become intoxicated. What does that mean? One is obligated to be, and this is from the Shulchan Aruch, by the way. One is obligated to become intoxicated on Purim until he's unable to distinguish between cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, in accordance with the opinion of the sage Rava. Some maintain that in the wake of an incident we're going to read about in a minute, that the halacha is no longer in accordance with Rava's opinion. One drinks only a bit more than he is accustomed to drink. Some maintain that one should drink until he falls asleep, at which point he will no longer be able to distinguish between Haman and Mordechai. If one damages another in the course of Purim festivities, some hold that he's exempt from the obligation to pay, but if the damages are substantial, the custom is not to exempt him, and then he has to pay. So let me share with you the story that was alluded to. This is a very famous story in the tractate Megillah, page 7b. So Rava and Rabbi Zera, they prepare a Purim feast with each other. They have a Purim Suda, the two of them together. Doesn't say that. Evidently, there were no other guests. There were two of them that were doing it. Two of them having their seudah, the celebratory meal of Purim together, and we said that the ibasum they get verschickert. They become intoxicated. So what happens? Kam Rabba shachte Rabbi Zera. They become intoxicated to the point that Rabba arose and he murdered Rabbi Zera. The next day he becomes sober and realizes what he'd done. He asks God for mercy and he revives Rabbi Zera. Brings him back from the dead. So the next year, and this is a wonderful story, Rabbi says to Rabbi Zera, come have Purim with me again this year. I'm going to invite you again to my Purim Suda. So what does he say to him? He declines with thanks, and he says, Lo v'chol shata v'shata mitrachish nisa. A miracle doesn't happen each hour. In other words, no way, Jose. Miracles don't happen every year. I'm not having my Purim Suda with you. So again, I don't think too many people, well, some people will take this story literally. I don't think that everybody will. There's obviously exaggeration here. It's kind of, I would say it's a legend. It's almost a comical legend. There's humor in it. When it could be a comedy routine. He kills him. Okay, guy has a good relationship with God, so he revives him. He gets him back from the dead. Maybe one can argue, if you want to analyze it more technically, and say he really wasn't dead. He was sort of like, he drank so much and he basically put him in a coma, but he was revived. But let's take it literally and say he was dead and he was brought back to life. And then he says, next year goes by and everything is fine. And he says, hey, come back, we had such a good time last year. And so Rabbi said, why I didn't have such a good time? It wasn't so much fun being dead. I could do better ways to spend. I'd rather watch Netflix. I don't really feel like being dead. So he turns him down. But so how this is viewed, based on the text that we just looked at before, this story appears right after the comment the comment of Rava, that you have to become sufficiently intoxicated so that you can't tell between Aru Haman Uvaruch Mordechai, blessed be Haman, cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. You can't be so drunk that you can't tell the difference between good and evil. In other words, you have to maintain a certain amount of hekerut, of awareness. You can't be so drunk. So the suggestion is this story comes immediately after that to give you a warning. Don't take this getting drunk so seriously. And that's clearly, I think, where this is coming from. It's an exaggerated story. There's a bit of humor in it, but the intent really is to say, don't take this too seriously. You can have something, you can drink a bit more than you used to, you can have a bit of fun, but you have to be careful. And one would add today, of course, in contemporary times when one is driving to shul on Purim, one has to be very careful and make sure that you are not drinking any more than would put you in a situation of danger in terms of driving. You have to be very careful, minimalize the drinking if you're going to be driving somewhere. That takes precedence over any Talmudic statement that says you should be drunk, because you're not supposed to be verschickert to the point that you can't tell the difference between good and evil. That's what that story tells us. A few years ago, when pre-COVID, I remember one night leaving shul on Purim night, and I'd had, for me, a huge amount to drink. I had one of these little thimblefuls of liquor. For me, that was a lot. So, but I'm not a drinker. But also, me, that was drinking. So I certainly wasn't over the legal limit at all. But Ride was out that night. The police were stopping in Jewish neighborhoods. Somebody had obviously warned them that Jews drink on Purim. So evidently they were at Bathurst and Lawrence. They were at Bathurst and Shepherd. They had Ride patrols where the police were checking cars to ask you if you had anything to drink. So I said, yeah, I had a tiny bit to drink, very little. I said, I don't drink at all. Thank God I survived. I got through it. They didn't make me take a breathalyzer test. I was very sober. but they already were onto the fact that sometimes Jews are driving at that point that shouldn't be. One has to be very, very, very careful, of course. Two little texts, and then we'll talk together a bit. Again, I'll take off the screen share. And so there are a couple of ways of looking at drinking and trying to minimize the requirement to drink. The Ramah, who, by the way, is the Ashkenazi source that accompanies the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, who's a Sephardic authority. And the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Israelis, writes the Ashkenazi subtext, which basically adds the where things differ in the Ashkenazi community from the Sephardic community. He brings that difference. So it's very important to study both together. So the Ramah, in adding to his comment to the provision in the Shulchan Aruch that talks about drinking on Purim, he says, some say it is not necessary to become drunk so much. It's not a great translation, actually. But rather to drink more than he's used to drinking, and to fall asleep. While he sleeps, that's when he doesn't know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. Not that he's drunk, but he's schluffing. He's sleeping. So you drink enough to put yourself to sleep. So you should drink to put yourself to sleep, not to be drunk, but to be schluffedig, to be sleeping. And then you're not going to know the difference between Mordechai and Haman. You're going to be in Never Never Land. You're going to be sleeping. That's one interpretation, trying to understand what this means. Then the Mishnah Torah says the following. Also bring sleep into the picture. What's our obligation for the Feast of Purim? You should eat meat. I told you that many assume that the gifts of food and the eating has to be meat. The people that were not vegetarians in those days very often. A person should eat meat and prepare as attractive a feast as his means permit. In other words, do the best you can. He should drink wine until he becomes intoxicated and falls asleep in his intoxication. Again, the reason for drinking is to put you to sleep. And then you're not going to be able to tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. So we should basically, we're learning from this, one of the great things you can do on Purim is go to sleep. So, there are times that a rabbinic sermon, I guess, can put people to sleep. I try not to do that too often because if I couldn't sleep, I wasn't going to let you sleep. But I'm sure it happened occasionally that somebody would fall asleep. So that should be, very lengthy, boring sermons and speeches should take place that put people to sleep on Purim. That may be what we should do instead of drinking, but I'm not going to recommend that. So let me see. I want to open now to questions and comments about anything we've talked about what we do on Purim, what the relevance of Purim to you, any ideas that you have for celebrating Purim, any great costume ideas, any great hamantash recipes. No, you're also quiet. Don't be like me. You need to talk. Say something. Oh, okay. That's Noreen. You get a second chance. Go ahead. You have to unmute. Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so my Auntie Anna and I have a very traditional hamantash recipe from her mother and my Bubby, because they were sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And my Bubby used to mail us in Welland every year a box of mun hamantashen in yeast dough. And then, as we grew older and I moved back to Toronto, whatever, we never did that anymore. And I mentioned this to Anna many years ago, and she says, oh, I think I have that recipe. Let me look. And she found the recipe, and every year, bar this year, we didn't do it. We make this recipe, and I give away my 18 I mail to Riva in the States, and she gives away her 18 hamantashen, and we carry on the tradition, and they are by far the best hamantashen in the world.
Wow. Okay.
Bar none.
So you have given people hot tips here.
I'll share the recipe, but I'm not making it for anybody else.
Well, that's nice to hear. Any other questions or comments on anything we've discussed about drinking, about Purim, about Megillah? So what do you think of the world today? Let's generalize. What are your thoughts on what's happening in the world today? What What do you tell your kids or your grandchildren? Maybe in some cases your great grandchildren. What do you tell them? Oh, I see. I'm sorry. Karen Shane raised a hand. So Karen, go on.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
Mordecai had supposed to have two, like Esther had two sons with Mordecai, and then how did they descend down to Israel? I just forget.
I honestly don't remember that either.
Yeah.
I'll research it and get back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, do not have an answer.
Okay.
It's part of being retired. You forget things. I don't remember what I did yesterday. So, okay, was one of the I forget where I was before that. I was gonna, yeah. What do you? I want to ask you a question. What do you, in general? What do you tell one of your kids, one of your grandchildren, one of your great grandchildren, somebody who's who looks up to you? You view that most people here have decades of experience in life, some more than others, but we have people here from their third decade to their 10th decade in life. And some of you have a lot of life experience. Many of you, most of you have a lot of life experience, and been through tough to bad times, been through good times. What do you tell people? What do you tell people who are scared, like your kids, your grandchildren? What's going on? They see the news, they're scared. What do you tell them? How do you reassure them? What do you say? How do you reassure ourselves? Can we? Any suggestions? The fact that there are, there aren't a lot, I don't see a lot of comment. I think that may be the fact that we don't know what to say. I would, although, we've been, I mean, the world isn't a, we often say, we just think, can things get worse? And then, give it, things can't get worse. And then next week happens and things get just, there's this absolute craziness. And, especially when there's something that happens for no reason. A purposeless invasion, like completely makes no sense, except for the sheer desire, megalomania, to desire to acquire land, but there's no threat, there's no danger, and to basically to totally destroy a country's economy, to totally gut a country, and to cause ruin that, forget the effects that we're feeling, but it's nothing compared to what they're feeling in that part of the world, but still we're feeling. Our portfolios have diminished. Our gas is expanding. It's not great here, but it's nothing compared to what it is there. But how do you part of it? And I began by the example of Ahasuerus being this terrible ruler, who has clearly has no business being a king of anything, is thrust in that role, and finally, luckily through intervention of two courageous Jews, does the right thing, but was on the route to doing something terrible. And how do we were so reliant on leaders that are often so not up to the task, or just coming from a very dark place. And we think we've seen the worst, and then we see something equally terrible, or just unimaginably bad. One of the ironies here, of course, that I think a lot of us feel is that Ukraine has not always been friendly to the Jewish people. I should offer a personal reflection. When I was in the former Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union back in 1981, just weeks before I came to Toronto, one of the places we visited was the city of Kherson, which was the first city to be overtaken by the Russians in the southern Ukraine. That was in the news. All of a sudden people have heard of Kherson. That's the city that was the second to last stop on our trip. We were in Moscow, in Kiev, Odessa, and then Kherson, and then back to Moscow, from where we departed the country. It was great to leave Russia, I have to tell you. But Kherson was a fascinating experience, because it was this little, relatively small. It's not that small a city, but it's compared to Moscow, it's a small city. It's, between town and city. They had a Jewish community then, 40 plus years ago. We were visiting refuseniks, so there had to be Jews there. That's how we were sent to Kherson to visit a Jewish family. Only one family that we saw in Kherson. There were a few that gathered together. And, I remember that as if I was there yesterday. It's 41 years ago. It'll be 41 years next month. It was as if I was there last week in terms of remembering what it was like, what it looked like. Incredibly warm, lovely people. And two things happened there that really struck me. And one was, I understood then how far removed Jews in offlying locations in the Soviet Union were from any kind of Yiddishkeit. And how I understood that was part of, I was there with a classmate. We both were going to be ordained the week after our return from Russia, from the Soviet Union. And so we explained that we're about to become rabbis. We're being ordained rabbis. And so, oh, that's great, rabbis. We have rabbis here. That's wonderful. And then they bring out the lunch, which literally was on a big tray. It was a pig, a roast suckling pig. And it never occurred to them that there was something incongruous about that. Of course, we managed to eat a couple of vegetables. We weren't going to embarrass them. But the most disconnected Jew in North America would know that if someone's a rabbi, you're probably not going to want to serve them pig. Or if you were doing it and you didn't realize ahead of time, you'd be a bit embarrassed. But they had no awareness that was not something that was not part of their... So that was just, I learned a lot from that. And again, they were really lovely people. They just didn't know. But one of the stories that I've told this story a couple of times over the years, every so often I've retold, but maybe not that often. But I remember we met a young man at that meal. His name was Aryeh Lev. He was there using his Hebrew name, Aryeh Gembaum. And he was an interesting young man because he was studying Hebrew with the late Yuli Kosherovsky in Moscow. Who was he was a person who was training Hebrew teachers. He was teaching people, and so Lev or Aryeh would learn a lesson. He'd be one lesson ahead of his students, and he was going back to Kherson to teach his lesson. He was originally from Novosibirsk, by the way, but he'd gravitated to Kherson in Ukraine. It was then known as the Ukraine. Now it's Ukraine. He was teaching Hebrew, but when we were giving our bio and saying that we're going to be ordained as rabbis, he said, I'd never met a rabbi before in my life. And we both looked at each other. And I told this story when I was the graduation speaker at our graduating dinner back at JTS a week later, and I was talking about some of these stories. And I said to them, that was the moment when all my rabbinic education became worthwhile. I said, I don't know what my career would be like in the rabbinate. I don't know how long. I don't know whether it's going to be a success, whether I'm going to burn out, I can't predict what my career will be like in the rabbinate. But for that moment in Kherson, it was worth all the 5 years of study. That this young Jew could say, I've met a rabbi. I've met two rabbis. That made everything worthwhile, and I've never forgotten that. I think Aryeh eventually made it to Israel. I've lost touch with him. Unfortunately, I wish I knew where he was. I lost the connection because I'd love to be able to reconnect with him. Maybe someday I will. But it just was that was a moment of incredible power. So when I was reading the news about Kherson, and it's like the first time ever since I was there that it's ever been in the news. It's been pictures from Kherson because it's the first city that the Russians took over in the invasion. It brought back that story to me. So I've really been thinking about that incident a lot. Odessa is is threatened now because it's an area that the Russians can easily access, and it's close to their border, and they want. So I don't know when it's happened today, but people are very scared about Odessa being overtaken. It doesn't have the defenses that Kiev seems to have at the moment, which seems to be still holding out for a while. In Odessa, we met a young woman named Ida Nipanyashi, and she was a 17-year-old girl who was teaching Hebrew classes. 17-year-old who was learning. She was teaching Hebrew. She was the Hebrew teacher of Odessa. And I said to him, when we got back, I said to my classmate, I said, Slomsberg, do you realize what this means? Don't you realize Odessa was where Bialik came from? He's the greatest Hebrew poet of the 20th century. And you had other, Chernyakhovsky was from Odessa. The true greats of Hebrew poetry coming from Odessa. And today, Hebrew education is in this wonderful 17-year-old girl. She's the only source of Hebrew in this town. What the Soviets had done, they had totally strangled Jewish learning and Jewish creativity and Jewish culture. And that's really unforgivable what they did. And now organizations such as the one I'm involved in and others are trying to help rebuild what was destroyed through all the years of communism. But you had these communities that were filled with a richness of Jewish learning. Of course, the Holocaust did its number as well. So much of the Jewish world was destroyed in Ukraine and in Russia and that part of the world during the Shoah. But that plus then communism taking away from the survivors any connection to the flame of Yiddishkeit. So to see again in Kherson, this young man, Aryeh, and in Ida Nepanyashi in Odessa. Moscow was different because Moscow we had Yuli Kosherovsky, who was qualified, like a real scholar, and you had a bit of a chevra there of people that would, because it's the big city, so you had more, of capability there for learning. But in the other smaller outlying areas, it was very, very, very small, and it was individual superstars. In other words, individual heroes and heroines of Jewish history that lit the spark, that kept the spark going of Jewish continuity, of Jewish spiritual life, and it was just amazing. I also should say that in Kiev, we never got to see the people we were supposed to see because we were tailed by the KGB constantly, and we never could escape to make the connection to the people that we were supposed to meet. We didn't want to get them in trouble, so we had 2 days in Kiev and we did nothing, unfortunately. So I can't say that we met. We were supposed to meet a couple of, Yuli Kislik we were supposed to meet. He eventually got to Israel. We couldn't see him because we were just, it was, but at least it's something, so what's been going on has brought back a lot of memories. I see Anna has a raised hand.
Yes, you are. My grandchildren haven't asked about the war. At least they've not asked me. They haven't asked me. But personally, I'm so very concerned because I see a couple of things happening, possibly. One is that the Ukraine will fall and Putin will be emboldened and move on to the next country. Then the other nations will say, "Oops, we should have tried to stop him." The other thing is, and they will, and we've got World War III. The other picture is that they do finally do what the only thing I think will stop him is to put armed forces there, and he's just crazy enough to use the bomb. So we've got World War III. So I am not at all hopeful at all.
Well, clearly there's a lot of realism in terms of the pessimistic view that you're presenting, and clearly a lot of people are suggesting that, God forbid, could be the scenario that we are going to be facing. If one wants to be optimistic in a very weird sense, is to say that the economic chokehold that's now being placed on the country, like the sanctions really are going to hurt, like severely, and the people are going to really, the ruble is worthless now. That ultimately there could be some kind of uprising.
He's so crazy, he'll react.
But there could be, maybe Lindsey Graham is right and someone's going to shoot him. One time I said, "Go Lindsay." But who knows? It really, it's hard to, it's very hard to find optimism. But I think there's gonna, maybe mine's greater than ours will come to some kind, but it's really, really hard to say. It's interesting that if Israel could have a role here, because Naftali Bennett has been doing some mediation, so that's really kind of interesting that happened. It didn't get a lot of attention, but he has rapport with both sides. Israel's in a precarious position because they have a lot of people in both countries, and they just really don't want to. They have to be, and they're in a very difficult place right now. They're clearly siding with Ukraine in terms of the injustice of this war, but they can't totally alienate the Russians because they're dependent upon Russia's power. They're in charge of Syria, and Israel's in trouble if Russia does. Russia now is allowing Israel pretty well free reign in Syria when they have to bomb out a Hezbollah site. Russia is letting them do it. If they antagonize the Russians, they won't have. So that for Israel's own security, they need to somehow keep that really very difficult place to be. But who knows? Maybe they're going to have a role, and Israel's going to have a role in bringing this to a better conclusion. Who knows? Really, really tough times. I saw that there was another. Rhoda, did you want to say something? Was it you? I saw a hand up. Anyone else?
Yes, Rabbi.
Okay.
With reference to the Megillah again, I have heard in various conversations where Mordecai was not her uncle, Esther's uncle, but her husband. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, there is that interpretation that he's actually yeah. Let me put it this way: there is the whole story of Purim, the whole Megillah, has very little historicity to it. In other words, there's very little historic authentication. Other events we're much better at being able to, like, Eicha, we know exactly when it happened. We know it's really hard. We don't know who this Ahasuerus really was. There are 5 or 6 different theories as to which Persian ruler he was. Some have argued that this story is totally fictitious. Some have said that it took place. We can't fix a date to it. We don't know exactly when this happened. We don't know. So to really understand who the characters are, it's very difficult to ascertain. We have no corroborating evidence at all. We do in other biblical stories. We do have corroboration. We can figure out who certain people are. We know who people. We know, most biblical figures, or many of them, we have some kind of idea of who they are because they're referenced in other cultures. The patriarchs are referenced in, sometimes you have Babylonian documents, you have, later Islamic texts, but you have various texts that will authenticate from another perspective. They corroborate a source. That's why, by the way, a journalist, a good journalist, when they're fact-checking a story, they need corroboration from someone else to really, before they know something is valid. Someone will say something, they need somebody to authenticate with that person. You don't have that in the story of Esther. There's no authentication of anything. So it's really hard to know. There are speculation as was he really uncle? Was he maybe a husband? What's the relationship here? And it's there's a certain lack of clarity. Because even the Hebrew word for dod can mean beloved. It doesn't have to mean uncle. That the word dod shali, my uncle, it's also dodi is my beloved. Dodi li, my beloved. So they're all, it's not totally clear. I suspect uncle is probably more, because again, it's a bit awkward. Husbands tend to have 2 wives. Wives don't tend to have 2 husbands. So it's a bit hard to explain that how does Mordecai encourage Esther to become the wife of the king if she's his wife? So I find that a little suspicious, but there's a certain lack of clarity. So that theory is out there. I don't hold by that theory because I think it's just too bizarre. But there's no way of authenticating any of the details of the story. So in other words, and I saw on the chat the question was asked, and I'm going to conclude with this: where does costuming come from? Just the idea of, it goes back a long time. The idea of the celebration of the frivolity, that was part of the frivolity was costuming. That's where it came from. I don't know if we have reference of I don't know how far back in history that goes, but it's just part of the idea that one can be frivolous, one can play, and it's considered in that sense to be harmless fun as opposed to the drinking, which can be serious. So part of there was the masquerading, the disguising, and again, the idea of allowing to let loose things you're normally not allowed to do. We have Some of you, I don't know, I'm now into Daf Yomi, doing the daily study page, and it's now Yevamot, which is the most difficult tractate in the entire Babylonian Talmud. Extremely difficult stuff, dealing with levirate marriage and stuff. It also deals with legal and illicit marital relations. It will also deal with cross dressing and stuff like that, which is prohibited in the Torah. Dealing with the whole issue of, it was considered to be an avera to cross dress. In other words, to dress as the opposite sex, but we're very relaxed on Purim and would allow things that we normally would not allow. I know one colleague of mine, I think he's deceased now, was a very senior colleague of mine when I was a rabbinical student. He was an unusual guy. And he was not renewed in his congregation because on Purim he dressed up as Santa Claus. And that did not go over well. That eventually cost him. That was not a career advancing move. People were offended by that. I mean, I guess, in a way it's sort of funny, but I guess it's bizarre, and I'm not about to do that anytime quickly. I'm not really big on. I followed. I think it was Jerry Begelman who referenced the late Justin Fromm of blessed memory, and I referenced, going back to my first year at Beth David. So he read the Megillah with great feeling, but his costume was that he wore like a kippah that was looked like a waiter's hat. That was his costume, like a hat that was a little higher than his normal kippah, and otherwise just normally dressed. And Rabbi Pappenheim, his costume was absolutely nothing because he just was not into it. That was not his thing. Again, part of the Germanic background where you just were very rigid and you didn't. So his celebrate. So Justin wore on his head like a hat that if you look closely you could see wasn't his regular kippah. And he was not. They were not into heavy costuming. Whereas, I could have so like me compared to Marshall Loomer or Michael Rubin, who come totally dressed like crazy. I'll wear my honeymooner's tie or something. As a part of my costume. Like I'm not on the wild side when it comes to too much. I'm not saying that as praiseworthy, but costuming is not something that's halachic, but it's something that's become very popularized in recent generations. Based on the idea of being frivolous and having fun and allowing to do things that you normally wouldn't be doing in more serious environments. And that's a good thing to be able to let go, letting loose. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing at all. So I'm going to say I don't like overtime. We've used up our 90 minutes. So Chag Purim Sameach to all, or as Israelis say, Simchat Purim, wishing you a joyous Purim next week. And we meet again in 2 weeks, and look forward to having a nice discussion in 2 weeks' time. Thank you all for joining tonight, and stay well and stay healthy and stay safe, and may things get better in the world. May there be peace. God willing, let's still pray for peace no matter how discouraged we might be. And as at least 2 of you have noted to me privately, rejoicing in the resumption of the baseball season. We'll be able to say in our last session, go Jays. We can, they just have to go spring training first. Take care, everybody. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Be well. Stay safe. I'll leave the live stream on for a couple of minutes if any of you want to chat with each other. I'll leave the stream on for a little while, but I won't shut it down. I'll let you talk if you want to. I'm just going to.
Good night, everyone.
Bye. Goodbye.